What's up guys, my name's Stu, and today we're going to be looking at my phaser turret build on the legendary Defiant. That's right guys, Lazy Boat 2.0 is finally here, this time with pilot maneuvers. When I first started thinking about doing a turret build, I always had large, difficult to maneuver cruisers in mind. I never really thought about doing one on an escort until my friend Kyuu Continuum started flying his on the legendary Defiant. Kyuu, by the way, is a fantastic content creator and you should definitely be following him, link down below. In fact, he's actually the person who gave my first turret build the Lazy Boat nickname. Anyway, it wasn't until he started doing it that I realized that putting the turret build on an escort, particularly a pilot ship, is actually kind of brilliant. For one, it's an escort, so you'll have enough tactical seating for Scatter Volley 3, meaning you'll get a bit more power out of those turrets. But also because pilot ships can be kind of difficult to fly too. They're very fast, and one accidental double tap can send you barrel rolling into who knows what direction. This could be really bad for a normal cannon build, or really any forward-facing DPS build. One wrong move and suddenly your enemies are no longer in your forward firing arcs. But that's not really a problem for a turret build because everything on it has a 360-degree firing arc. So, let's take a look at it. Here we go, Lazy Boat 2.0. Like I said earlier, this time I'm using phaser turrets instead of anti-proton. Early on, I had intended to use agony phasers for this build, but then I had the idea that it might be funny for each turret to be a different type of phaser. So I put up a poll on Twitter and left the decision to you guys, which was a huge mistake because you all voted for the funny one. It seemed like a funny idea at the time, but some of these turrets ended up being quite expensive, so I hope you guys appreciate my commitment to the joke. Since this is a phaser build, I'm using both the turret and the Omni Beam version of the Trilithium phaser. This way I get two separate chances for the haste buff the Trilithium weapons give. The rest of the weapons here are just other phaser turrets. Like I said earlier, I wanted to use agony phasers for its chance to disable and its damage over time proc. But for this video, I am using a pulse phaser, a sensor linked phaser, a covert phaser, a 32nd Century phaser, a phased biomatter turret, and a phasic harmonic turret. Most of these phasers are actually pretty good when used as a full set, but individually I'm not going to be getting much out of any of their procs. Next is my standard energy weapon setup, the Fleet Colony Deflector for its buffs to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation Engine for its speed buffs, a Deuterium Stabilized Warp Core for its reduced weapons power cost, though non-engineers would benefit more from the Terran Task Force Warp Core for its buff to maximum power levels, and the Discovery Reputation Shield for the extra damage it gives against enemy shields. In the devisors, first I've got Energy Amplifier for the bonus damage to my energy weapons, Reactive Armor Catalyst in case I need a quick heal, Deuterium Surplus for the speed buff, and Kobayashi Maru Transponder for the random buffs. In the Universal Console slot is Lorca's Custom Fire Control. I won't have access to its set bonuses with this build, but this console is still really nice on its own thanks to its buffs to crit chance, weapons power setting, and shield penetration. This console is available through the Discovery Reputation. Next is the DPRM from the Atlas Prototype Dreadnought. Its massive 40% buff to bonus damage is the reason why we call this the best console in the game. The Domino from the Bajoran Interceptor is often said to be the second best console in the game, thanks to its impressive buffs to bonus damage and firing cycle haste. The Assimilated Module from the Task Force Omega Reputation. This is here for its buffs to crit chance, crit severity, and weapons power setting. Approaching Agony gives a passive Cat 1 buff to phaser damage, as well as a small buff to crit chance. But its click ability gives a nice damage resistance debuff as well as an additional phaser damage over time effect. This console comes from the lockboxes but isn't bound to a ship, so it's pretty easy to get on the exchange. The next two are from the Low-Buy store and are pretty standard on most of my DPS builds. The Tachyokinetic Converter for its buffs to crit chance, crit severity, and turn rate, though we probably won't need that turn rate much on this build. And Bioneural Infusion Circuits because it has the best crit severity buff of any console in the game. And finally, Fakiri Torment Engine for its buff to non-hazard damage over time effects. This comes from the episode Leap of Faith from the Klingon Civil War arc, and a bunch of vulnerability locators from the Fleet Spire for their buffs to phaser damage and crit chance. For my specializations, again, standard setup for my DPS builds, Intelligence Officer as my primary to gain access to space flanking, and Temporal Operative as my secondary to gain access to Entropic Rider, which is being buffed by the Fakiri Torment Engine. In the personal space traits, first we have Adaptive Offense for the crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back, Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff, Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on your team size, Fragment of AI Tech for the buff to your energy weapons based on your controller expertise skill, Innocuous for the buff to crit severity and reduced threat generation, Inspiration Leader for a chance to buff most of your starship skills, Intel Agent Attaché to reduce the recharge of my captain's abilities every time I score a critical hit, Superior Cannon Training for the bonus damage to my cannon weapons, turrets do count as cannons, Terran Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity, and Unconventional Systems to shave a little bit of time off the cooldown for my Universal consoles every time I use a control ability. Ignore the Boimler effect in the last trait slot. The ISE you're going to see was recorded before this trait existed, and before the Elite Captain's tokens too, so I'm going to be showing you the build as it was then, though I'll go over this trait and how to set up for it in the additional notes section of the video. In the Starship traits, first is Emergency Weapons Cycle. This is here for its firing cycle haste buff and its reduction to weapons power cost every time I use emergency power to weapons. Overpowered and Overgun does basically the same thing, but its duration is based off of my global crit chance. Promise of Ferocity gives me a stacking bonus damage buff every time I use a tactical or pilot bridge officer ability. Strike from Shadows decreases my threat generation by 60% and gives me a small buff to crit chance and bonus damage whenever I fire at a target that isn't shooting at me. Tearing Goodbye for its stacking buff to crit chance and accuracy. And Withering Barrage because it extends the duration of Cannon Scatter Volley by 4 seconds. And the Space Reputation traits, again, pretty standard stuff for my energy weapon builds. Advanced Targeting Systems for the buff to crit severity. Precision for the buff to crit chance. Tyler's Duality for more buff to crit chance based off of my hull capacity. Magnified Firepower for the bonus weapon damage, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus weapon damage against controlled targets. In the Bridge Officer seating, first I'm using an Engineer in this Universal Lieutenant seat. First is Emergency Power to Engines 1 for the speed buff, and Aux to Bat 1 as part of my Bridge Officer cooldowns. In the Commander Tactical console, first is Distributed Targeting, Attack Pattern Beta for the debuff, Attack Pattern Omega for the bonus damage buff. While attack pattern abilities do share a cooldown, that shared cooldown is only 15 seconds long. Beta only lasts for 10 seconds, and Omega only lasts for 15 seconds, so you're not going to be hurting the effectiveness of either one by using both. This way you'll just be flip-flopping between the two constantly. And Cannon Scatter Volley 3, because technically this is a cannon build. In the Lieutenant Tactical seat, first is Chemosite Lace Weaponry 1. This has a chance to add a small radiation AoE to my weapons fire. And Beam Overload 2 to buff that Omni Beam I'm using. In the Engineering seat, I'm using Let It Go 1 for the debuff, my other Aux to Bat for my cooldowns, and Emergency Power to Weapons 3 for the bonus damage to my energy weapons and to trigger Emergency Weapon Cycle. In the Science seat, I've got Tractor Beam to trigger Unconventional Systems, and Structural Analysis 2 for the debuff, and because it's the only other science ability I could think of that would benefit my damage, that also has a 360-degree arc. The duty officers are pretty straightforward. First are 3 energy weapon officers, 2 that have a chance to increase my crit chance every time I fire an energy weapon, and 1 that does the same thing for my crit severity, and the 3 technicians that are necessary for an Aux to Bat build for my bridge officer cooldowns. I did consider making one change to this build. Normally I loathe pilot seating due to its unremarkable abilities, but I did consider adding Form Up 1 to this build. Form Up lets you select a friendly target and then teleports you to within 5 kilometers of their location. Additionally, it also gives you and that friendly target bonus damage for a time as long as you stay within 5 kilometers of that target. Normally, Form Up is too unreliable to be useful because you never know what direction you're going to be facing after that teleport. You can't really take advantage of that bonus damage when all of your enemies are outside of your firing arcs. But that's not a problem for this build. This is the Lazy Boat. Everything on it has a 360-degree arc. Ultimately, I decided to go without it for 2 reasons. It would require at least one other member of the team to get where I want to go first, and pilot ships aren't exactly slow. I figure I'd be lucky to get maybe 1 use out of this, and that just didn't seem worth it. Especially considering I would have to give up Attack Pattern Omega in order to slot Form Up. I'm getting a lot more use out of that, so it seemed like the smarter choice to stick with. Pilot seating. Just when you think it might be useful for something, it still isn't. Now, I mentioned earlier that I made this build before the Boimler effect came out. I thought about adjusting it because, as it is, Boimler effect is really powerful right now. It was buffed in the last patch and it's performing so well that it's actually replacing Aux to Bat. This is pretty great. So great that I'm worried that Cryptic might think it's too great. I'm getting paranoid that Cryptic might end up nerfing it, so I'm a little hesitant to dive too deeply into this trait. That said, I've already dived pretty deep, so if this trait does get nerfed to the point where it's no longer useful, I am going to rage. Especially because they put this trait in the low-buy store, so it was not cheap. Anyway, as I was saying, if you're going to set up this build with the Boimler effect as it currently is, then you're not going to need your 2 Aux to Bats or your 3 technicians. I'd replace one of those Aux to Bats with directed energy modulation, and add that Dulmer duty officer for the reduced weapons cost. I'm still trying to figure out what to replace that second Aux to Bat with. There aren't a lot of engineering abilities left at that level that'll be useful. Same with the pilot abilities. I mean, I guess there's Reinforcement Squadron. I'd hardly call it useful, but it'd be funny, and it still fits the theme. That still leaves 2 duty officer slots open. The emergency con hologram might be useful. Getting more use out of evasive maneuvers can be pretty helpful. Not really sure what to put in that last duty officer slot yet. Though, like I said, this is all dependent on whether or not Boimler effect stays in its current condition or not. If it does, I'll take some time to explore some more options, but as it is, I'm going to leave it at this. So, stay tuned for the ISE and then the Parse. 204k. Really not bad for a turret build, but honestly I think I could have done a little bit better. There's a pretty sizable lag spike at that first transformer, and then I had to go chase a wandering sphere, plus I'm using a bunch of different kinds of phasers. With a smoother run and a more consolidated weapon setup, I probably could have gotten at least 220 out of this. That said, I really can't complain about a meme boat that does anywhere above 200k. Yeah, that's the build. I hope you find it helpful in setting up your own turret build. I really enjoyed having this opportunity to revisit the turret build, looking at it from another direction. It's a total meme build, but I have so much fun with it. I hope you guys are enjoying them too, because I've got 2 more that I'm planning on doing. I've got enough turrets for a plasma and disruptor version of the lazy boat. I just need to upgrade and re-engineer the turrets, which sadly is probably going to take a while. Again, shout out to Kyuu Continuum for giving me the idea for this variation of the turret build. Also, big thanks to Big Papa Tar for setting up this ISE during his livestream. You should definitely check him out if you haven't already. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. I know you've all heard it before, but it really does help the channel and I do appreciate it. Anyway, my name's Stu, and I'll see you guys next time.